generators associated with those tanks. Leah?
So it's
I'm sorry.
rain catcher?
I think the areas can identify what would work best for them. We're not trying to tell people, it's not our job to say, you guys need to do this and this and this. It's say, bring a proposal to us, give us high need, we'll package that, and we think there's an opportunity to get some support for those high needs. Leah?
So where this came from is in the campfire, nobody could show up for 30 minutes, and actually 30 minutes is a pretty short time. So what we've learned is you have to be able to fight the fire from within while you're waiting for support from without, and then the airplanes couldn't fly. I mean, it's just a catastrophe that every community knows could happen in their community. So the challenge for us is to have some internal source of water that doesn't rely on electricity for initial response within these towns. And each town's gonna be different. If you have Lake Amador next door, you're gonna have one approach. If you have Round Valley Reservoir, you might use water. And if you have drinking water supplies, other places like Paradise, it'll take $300 million to get their drinking water back. And so they would want a fire tank, and Quincy here would probably want a fire tank that's also emergency water. So that's a different kind of approach. So it's kind of find your water, what's your emergency water, how do we support that? So you have some response capacity inside your communities while you're waiting for help.
I have a silly but not so silly example. When the Moonlight Fire, which burned 11.5 years ago, burned here, it was Labor Day. So most of the ponds and creeks, they were dry. I drove a tanker truck around begging ranchers to use their stock pond or something else. It was hard finding water to feed the frontline engines that were keeping fire off of houses. So I'd drive up to the San Bernardino fire truck with a tanker full of water, and I'd fill them up and go to the next one, and I'd run around the valley to try to figure out where I was going to get the next load. It was that desperate. I mean, I felt like an idiot in some ways, but I felt it was really desperate trying to find water, which was ludicrous.
So
In
I
some
want
ways.
to talk about something about 15 years ago when I was in Nevada County. This ties in with this rural requirement to install a tank on your house. And the division chief, Tony Clarabit at the time, came to me with this idea that maybe what we should be doing, instead of having people install these individual tanks, let's take the money, group it together, and strategically locate major water tanks that the fire department would know where to go, and they would be filled in case we had a fire. Now, we looked at that 15 years ago, and it's pretty complex, and to my knowledge, it didn't happen there. I came here. But it is somewhat tied in with CAL FIRE's water tank requirements, which, by the way, are a misnomer. That tank cannot fight your structural fire. The capacity of those tanks was so low. It was really there for CAL FIRE, if they could hook up to it, and that was one of the other issues. The hardware didn't always match to fight the wildland fire. Your house is burning, but they wanted to stop the wildland fire, the fire from getting into the wildlands. So now I'm hearing 15 years later, everybody's kind of grabbing onto this idea of centrally, strategically located tanks to help fight fires. And it's a great idea, and I'm glad it's happening, but it was discussed 15 years ago in Nevada County. And it was difficult, because where do you locate them? So it takes a lot of consideration, but I like it. I like the idea. I like it's got some traction right now, because I really think it's something that's really needed. Because Jonathan just gave the example. He's driving around trying to get water out of ponds that are dry. And people would know where these tanks were.
Yes?
Is the Governor's Office of Emergency Services involved in any of this at all? Because there should be a lot, after the campfire, there should be a lot of FEMA hazard mitigation funds kicking around in terms of the losses. I mean, lots
Yes.
of it is California.
And the challenge is this whole integrative effort. So FEMA, Cal OES, CAL FIRE, keep adding the alphabet soup of agencies that are talking about these issues. And I presented to the governor's task force and said one of the challenges is this whole, this integrating agency work, so somebody doesn't say, well, that's really not our responsibility. We can do a little piece of it, but not all of it. And oh, well, that's sort of what we do, but we really can't fund that.
That's what we found out, yeah.
And so
Yeah.
when I told them that I had just done the workshop at the where the campfire had taken place, and Not trying to win friends, I blamed everybody on the Forest Management Task Force for the campfire. And then said, no, I said I accept some too, because we knew of that problem 20 years ago. It was told to us 20 years ago, and we did not deal with it. But I was trying to wake them up, quite honestly, and just say, we've got plenty of other examples. Nevada City, somebody was telling us their community, the train stops, and it's always stopped there, and the only way they can get out the road, they have to crawl under the railroad car, because that's the one road out of the area. So that would be a high priority for a tank, I would think. And there ought to be some agreements with the railroad about what happens when that sort of thing. But those are just a couple of examples that we learned through these assessments of needs. They're all over the Sierra. This is not, again, for most of you, it's like, oh yeah, we know about that. But agencies are beginning to know a little bit more, hearing about it. And what I think also gives us traction is when CAL FIRE did that emergency report, Newsom came in, said you got 45 days. In terms of timing, we know how important these disasters are for making things happen. So Newsom came in, the campfire just happened, he's there looking at all of this, and he gave CAL FIRE 45 days to put out that report. So CAL FIRE did what CAL FIRE does, which is focus on communities, high-value homes, forests, and so there were a number of communities that are now priorities, and they said, go deal with this. So they're running to deal with this, but what a surprise, most of our rural, lower value homes with these forests are not, for the most part, a part of that. Am I faulting them for it? No, they're doing what they know how to do, but the cool thing is they're saying, hey, this could fit with that idea of support. So that's why there may be additional support for this kind of a project, which immediately addresses some of the interests that we have. And I did challenge CAL FIRE also. I said, you do know that the forests, when they burn up, we talk about the deaths in Paradise, and there were, 88, but recent article that an epidemiologist put out, the wine country fires killed 100 plus in the Bay Area just from the smoke and PM 2.5. And that was the immediate identification, the loss of life. He said, would you send me that article, please? I said, sure. So I hope we don't collectively miss the forest for the trees. So when these big forests burn, and we're dumping all kinds of smoke into Sacramento and San Francisco, Bay Area, et cetera, that there are a lot of people affected. And so if you're really concerned about loss of life, you've got to think a little bit bigger and broader about that. But I'm digressing and getting into other stuff, so that's beyond what I'm supposed to be doing here today in terms of updating on this IRWM process. So any other questions? Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry, yes.
So, I work for Gold Mountain Community Service District. I'm Judy Claude. I'm a fire manager. I'm from the Tahoe Basin. And my biggest frustration with grants is this disadvantaged community. And it has to do with the income aspect of it. Because I find on some disadvantaged maps that the incomes are not, like if you compare it to the census, it's like 43,000, but when you go to some of these other disadvantaged community maps where various agencies, I'm not just saying DWR, it's 100,000, and so I need to understand where are they getting the income information, and if you have a high percentage of second homeowners, so obviously they make a lot of money, but they don't really live there. Or let's say some of the communities here, Gold Mountain for instance, you look at the homes and it's kind of up here in the income bracket, but yet we're trying to help do different projects, forestry projects, what have you, to help the communities around us. So then you look at Portola, which I would assume it is a disadvantaged community. But that's the part that I don't know how to argue that factor on a lot of grants, except for to show them that, no, people here, whatever community I'm working for, don't make this kind of money. And they are very disadvantaged, but where do you get the income information, and why, do you see
I know exactly what you're asking.
Okay, so I'm new to coming to this group, and I thank you for having me. But I would really like to understand a little more, because I'm like in this grant mode, and it's like, do I waste my time spending all this labor and trying to argue the fact when I'm talking to the grant people, whether there was Sierra Nevada Conservancy or whatever, and they say, well, we might discuss it. Well, no, I need to somehow argue this factor, because if I can prove to them that their information is skewed, then maybe we might have a chance.
So as you can see from this map, there's no problems with Portola and that area because it's the cow and virus screen. So if somebody uses this, you've got the first issue is you've got to say, you've got to look at it a different way, and people are increasingly recognizing that, yes, we need to do that.
So,
But in answer to the income question, there are diverse sources. Census Bureau does have some, and they are tied to the block groups or census tracts. And sometimes those units are too big or they encompass too much for your area. That's when you start looking at other alternatives like free and reduced lunch program data. And we can have a longer conversation about this, and I'm happy to share
yeah, I
some
would
ways
like
of
to
getting
get your
at that.
contact.
Because
info.
you're asking
I
a question
knew, and I would really like to
that
talk
we
to
wrestled with for a while, but it's also why some districts will actually do income surveys, which creates its own sort of problem because some people won't respond to those income surveys. So that's no panacea either. And then, sorry, I'll get only a little tiny bit political. If you add a question to the Census Bureau that says, are you a citizen or not, you just lost a bunch of your population that's likely to pull down your income level, so you're gonna have an artificially high income level. You will lose a portion of the population, and if the goal of the Census Bureau is to capture all the people in an area, you don't wanna ask questions that are gonna start reducing who answers the survey. So for us social scientists, we pull out our hair and say, oh, please don't do that, because we know what's gonna happen with that. And it's about getting data that is accurate, that ultimately we can use to make the cases that we need to make to justify the funding and the disadvantaged nature or the lower income strata that is why they need to support the area. So we can have a longer
That
conversation.
would be wonderful.
Jonathan,
So
doesn't
I just have one more,
DWR use?
Excuse me, go ahead.
one more question. Do all the state agencies use the same disadvantaged maps and info?
Fortunately, they don't.
Okay, because that's what I'm finding, but I wasn't sure if it was the same information.
But that does not mean we can sit back and go, boy, we're sure glad we got these other ways of doing it. I was really happy to see DWR just take the 80–85% median household income. And so DWR started there, which is a good place to start, and that's that other map. I don't know if you want to pull up the map with the cross-hatching. It's a much better place to start with, but it still leaves, so all these cross-hatched area, so severely disadvantaged, that's their 80%, and there's 85% of median household income, but look at the gaps. It's not because they missed something, they couldn't get the data for some of these areas. And so that's one of the reasons. It's still incomplete. And so we made a decision to go for block group data because we can capture the entire region, every single area. And so then you say, this is a silly community. We say, yeah, I'm sorry, I know, but we at least captured them all. So that's a bias that we built in, that we acknowledge, but it's not a fatal bias, and it doesn't harm the data, so to speak. But we said, let's get everybody involved. Just like we're actually going out and Trina's working to capture up the different tribes. And the tribes might be part of this community or this community, but they're not, the rancheria in that particular area may be particularly impoverished, but it doesn't stand out because the rest of the area is well-to-do, and so we need to capture that nuance. Randy, you were gonna?
I was just gonna mention the DWR 80% of median. I think it's what, 58,000 or something like that.
Yeah, it depends, family of four,
Right,
I don't have an exact number for that, but typically a family of four, that's what they use. Okay, I probably overrun my time here, so.
Any other questions for Jonathan? Thank you very much. I think we got a little off topic, but I think everybody here needed to hear that discussion.
Okay,
Thank you.
good.
Okay, that brings us to item 4, which is Prop 1 IRWM implementation grant round 1 solicitation.
I just wanted to ask Jonathan if he had any other updates. We kind of touched on this already and with this last presentation about the next steps for the round one implementation. A lot of this gets into the final project solicitation package has been released. But the question I have that I'm not clear on, and maybe Jonathan can answer, is what are our next steps as far as the coordinating for the round one projects?
That's part of the next call that we're gonna have, and then planning the work. Originally, we're requiring people to participate in workshops. That's no longer required. They're optional workshops. There's some, DWR is doing some webinars upcoming, explaining it more. We'll get those out to folks.
Okay.
So it's in process, and we're jumping in, and I will, as I sent out a note to the disadvantaged community and tribal involvement group members, we've been a little bit behind the 8 ball ourselves because of our change in staff and so forth, but we're up and running. Notes are going out, and we're going to keep folks apprised of it.
So Jonathan, real quickly, at one point I thought without CABI, the agreement with the 8 IDAR was to split it about $1 million apiece, right? But that fell apart with CABI. We were all in a
Correct.
bundle. And there was agreement within the group, and then CABI came in and said, basically we want it all, I think. But
50% at least, yes.
yeah, and that spun the whole process a different way. And I wasn't aware that then it got qualified to just disadvantage, because I think we agreed everybody take about $1 million and go forth with their projects, but then that's falling apart. So we had that almost there at one point, I think.
Yeah, and we may yet recover it in some way, to be determined.
Is there,
Just drive me nuts.
yeah, I was gonna try to put that professionally, but it's really difficult. Is there a sense of urgency with anybody?
I like that.
Government? Well, yeah, I was just gonna say, come on. But it just seems like this has been drug on for so long, even the people that are even involved in it would say, hey, can we get something done? Or is that silly?
Far be it for me to defend DWR, but the Prop 1 process is moving forward, and they were given this chunk of money to distribute with certain requirements, and they're left trying to determine how best to do that. And I think that the groups feel the urgency. We're going to be moving on it with the PSP finally released. And there will be things happening over the next 3 months, and some funding will likely be made available. There was the division of funding. We're at a 65-35 division of funding for first year, second year, and that's why bringing in additional dollars is important as well. So yeah, as far as the group concerns, absolutely. DWR is feeling the pressure to produce, and I think appropriately so, which is not to say they haven't been doing their job, but I think a lot of it, as these things typically get mired in some of the legal minutia, and being constantly asked to determine. But I'd also like to just maybe end by saying these different IRWMs have come together in ways that they have not come together before. And it's been a pleasure, not all the time, most of the time, watching that process evolve and helping folks sort of come together around this. So we're going to keep nudging it to see if we can't have that and support that effort, and I think it makes it the groups and those who have come together so much more competitive and presents more of an opportunity.
Are there things that we can do as our region to prepare for that round one, or is it just a wait and see how the discussions go over the next couple of months?
It's easy for me to say wait and see, but I'll make sure I get back in touch with you all about those sorts of things, or your representatives. So I don't want to say, nah, don't worry about it. But yeah, there are some things, and do I know that list right now? Not fully. So I have to do some more work, and we are working with DWR to try to make sure we characterize all those next steps appropriately.
Thank you.
Sure.
Anything on that, any more on that item?
I don't think so. I could go through the solicitation package requirements. But we could also wait till we have more information about what's coming next.
I think we might as well wait, because it seems like the whole thing's in a state of flux, pretty much, put it mildly. Okay, item 5 is IRWM plan implementation project proposal, and before we go into that, I'll let everybody know that if you can manage to sit through this one, we're gonna take a short right after that, so go ahead, Emma.
Thank you. So we do, just to kind of look through where we are with the project solicitations. This is for implementation project solicitations for inclusion in the plan, which is important to be eligible for certain funding opportunities that come up. So it's not actually for implementation funding at this time. Our approach has been that we have an open solicitation, so the forms for submitting a project are on our website, and they can be submitted at any time, and then we collect those, staff does an initial review on them, and then they come to the management group at the next quarterly meeting for consideration. So we did receive one new application in the last few months, actually very recently. And this is to cover, it's from the Butte County Resource Conservation District, and it covers the area of the campfire. We do have Kelly Peterson here from Butte County who can help out with some questions, but I'll give a brief overview first. Some of the partners who have been confirmed for this project are Butte County Fire Safe Council, Plymouth National Forest, the Extension System, and some private landowners. The general location is the Concal Basin, so it's from Jarbo Gap to the east, and including the communities of Paradise and Adelia, and then it goes down to Chico on the west side. So it does cover the areas impacted by the campfire. So the project proposal is basically to replant the campfire area with a climate resilient oak woodland. It could treat 4,000 to 12,000 acres, 4,000 to 12,000 acres, and would be designed to be a strategic fire shed buffer for the communities in that area. The benefits would be our fire, fuels, and forest management, ecosystem restoration, and recharge area protection. The budget estimate was about $10 million for the project overall. The staff did do a review, and they have submitted the necessary components of the application. They included a climate change assessment and the greenhouse gas analysis forms, and it was reviewed against the project review factors from 2016 composition on guidelines. Just as a reminder, these are the review factors from the 2016 guidelines that we went through. I won't read them all. I would say that the one that they are lacking right now is the adoption of the Upper Feather River plan. So they could it could be accepted into the plan, but before they could do an application, they would need to formally adopt the plan as a group. So this is summary, it meets the climate adaptation requirements, and it also addresses 6 out of our objectives, and 8 of the resource management strategies included in the plan. It does benefit disadvantaged communities, and the project is in the design phase. So the actions for consideration today are to discuss and accept the project, the implementation project for inclusion in the plan, and there is a resolution in the packet that would do that, or to provide additional direction to staff. And I think that Kelly said that she could answer some questions.